Summit meetings are as important for their symbolism as they are for their substance. Sometimes they are more important for their symbolism than substance. Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea have all held summit-level meetings with ASEAN leaders. The question is, President Bush had wanted to hold a summit meeting in the year 2007, but it never materialized. So the question is, will President Obama hold a summit meeting with ASEAN? When asked this question by the Senate, Mrs. Clinton was very cautious. She promised to consider, and I quote, when and as appropriate, the holding of a presidential level summit with ASEAN. I suspect that the sticking point may be the participation of Myanmar, although I had hoped that the new administration will choose engagement and negotiation with Myanmar over a policy of isolation and sanction. The best course of action for the new administration to take on Myanmar is to support the Gambari mission, which has been able to engage all parties in Myanmar. And if a US-ASEAN summit cannot be held, I hope that President Obama will consider meeting the leaders of the 7 ASEAN countries, which are members of APEC, when he comes to Singapore in November this year for the APEC summit. 9th, during the Clinton administration, the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, had proposed that the United States, Singapore, Chile, and Australia should negotiate a quadrilateral free trade agreement to act as a nucleus which would eventually lead to an APEC-wide FTA. But because of a change of administration, Ambassador Barshevsky's initiative did not blossom. Instead, 4 countries, not all of those she had in mind, namely Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, have concluded such an agreement. And I'm very pleased to say that more recently, Australia, Peru, the United States, and Vietnam have expressed their wish to join this quadrilateral agreement, which has been called the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership. Quite a mouthful. When asked by the Senate whether the Obama administration will continue to participate in these talks, Mrs. Clinton was non-committal, saying that the administration will work with Congress to review the status of these talks and whether they would advance the administration's objectives for any trade agreement. And she mentioned 3 objectives. 1, whether the agreement would ensure the greatest possible benefits for U.S. exporters, workers, and consumers. 2nd, whether it contains binding standards of labor and environmental protection. And 3, whether the agreement will be rigorously monitored and enforced. I hope that the Obama administration will continue with the Clinton and Bush administration's bipartisan policy. And I emphasize this, that it's a bipartisan policy of support for APEC. The United States will be the APEC chair in the year 2011. And I think it has a unique opportunity to work with the current chair, Singapore, the next chair, Japan, in order to advance our agreed goals and to respond in a positive way to the global economic crisis. I would just say to my American friends that APEC is a success story, that without binding trade agreements, intra-APEC trade is today 60% of APEC's trade with the world. And the 21 economies of APEC account for 60% of world GDP and 50% of world trade. And I believe that free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific is very much in the interest of the United States. Let me conclude with a final point. I will conclude by confessing that ASEAN does have one worry on our mind regarding the Obama administration. The worry is whether the Obama administration will stand up for free trade or whether it will give in to protectionism. The United States, as we all know, is faced with the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Every month, more Americans lose their jobs and their homes. At a time like this, it is very tempting to be expedient and to resort to protectionist measures in order to save jobs. However, the lesson that we have all learned from the Great Depression is that protectionism is not the answer. On the contrary, protectionism will lead to trade wars, which will lead to an economic disaster for all of us. I therefore conclude by expressing the hope on behalf of all my ASEAN brothers and sisters that this United States administration and Congress will continue to support policies which will keep the world's markets open. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think now we come to the South Asia section of the report. But let me begin by thanking John Brandon for giving me this opportunity to be part of this process on examining the U.S. role in Asia. And it's been a great experience working with Ambassador Tomiko and Minister Hong Sang-joo because to learn about the other regions and more interestingly about the nature of the U.S. interaction with these two regions. As you all know that South Asia is relatively new to Asia, at least if you look at the recent span of history, that we were not really part of the great debates in so-called Asia. But as events have changed, as the rise of India and ASEAN's own interest in India, ASEAN's interest in bringing both East Asia and South Asia together, has seen a fundamental change in terms of interest in South Asia and the natural way of seeing this region, that is South Asia as part of Asia. That process has begun, and I think we've been a part of this way of rethinking how we look at this region as a whole. Now, when we joined this work on this report, I think it's most people were quite excited in the sense there was one thing was certain, that George Bush would no longer be the president. That itself was, for many, it was in the U.S., in many parts of the world, that itself was a cause for a celebration. So the fact is that when you have a major change in Washington, that too after 8 years, that it was going to be a period of significant policy change. So there was across-the-board interest in the United States, in Asia, of what the next administration might look like and what it would do. So therefore, policy recommendations in this context had a special urgency and attractiveness that is not normally associated with in the ordinary kind of transitions that take place in the United States. So it was a special occasion. But I think in retrospect, the financial crisis and the extraordinary changes that have been wrought by it is going to make the next 4 years, I think, very definitive, very decisive in the nature of the U.S., not just U.S. interaction with Asia, but how U.S. sees itself, its role in the world, and how the U.S. should readapt its foreign policy strategy to a new circumstance, a kind of circumstance that the U.S. has not faced before. So as Obama said, facing two wars and a crisis the first crisis in almost 70 years. So therefore, it is an extraordinary moment in the evolution of the U.S. Role in the world, and I think that has made this being in this process a very special one. When we looked at South Asia, what we wrote in this report is not just about India, though I'm from India. We had people from all the South Asian countries. There were two ways of doing reports, as most of you know who've done reports, which is do a laundry list of what everyone has said so that you don't get into a controversy. The other is to say, look, we'll pick up a few big themes and focus on them rather than trying to list out everybody's concerns. Because as you know, the American attention span is not famous for being too long, nor it makes any sense. No one is going to read a report which has 50, 100 recommendations on any particular region. So what we decided, I think, at the very outset was to say, look, focus on something critical, significant, that would be of interest in the United States and that is of some consequence within the region itself. So therefore, what we chose at that point was to focus on Afghanistan.